Good evening and welcome to McConnell Hall at Central Washington University in Ellensburg, the venue for the first and only debate in the 2018 race for Washington's 8th Congressional District. I'm Natalie Brand from King 5.
And I'm Ross Reynolds from KUOW Radio. This debate has been organized by the Washington State Debate Coalition. It was founded by the Seattle CityClub in 2016 to enhance Washingtonians' access to those who hold office and seek to hold our state's highest elected offices.
Financial support has been provided by our lead sponsors, AARP of Washington, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the NORCLIFFE Foundation. We also want to thank Central Washington University for hosting this event in partnership with the Kittitas County Chamber of Commerce, the Associated Students of Central Washington University, and the Ellensburg Daily Record. Along with these school districts, Ellensburg, Kittitas, Thorpe, Cle Elum, Roslyn, and Easton.
And we invite you to join the conversation on social media as you watch the debate by using the hashtag WAELEX. Now, we have a large audience here in the theater, and they have agreed to watch and listen, no cheers, no boos, and to hold their applause until the end of the debate, except for now, as we meet the candidates, Republican Dino Rossi and Democrat Kim Schrier. Welcome to both of you.
The format for tonight's debate is simple. Each candidate will have 90 seconds for an opening statement. Questions will then be asked to both candidates, and they will each have 1 minute for an initial response. Ross and I will then lead a follow-up discussion on that topic before moving on to the next question. So let's get started. We flipped a coin, and Dr. Schrier will have the first opening statement. Dr. Schrier, you have a minute and a half.
Good evening. I'm Kim Schrier. I'm a pediatrician, a wife, and a mom. I've spent the past 17 years taking care of children and families in Issaquah, and I can tell you that the policies of this administration are a real threat to children and families everywhere. I've always gone to bat for my patients, and so when Congress tried to repeal the Affordable Care Act and take away protections for people with pre-existing conditions, I went and met with my congressman's office and explained all the ways that would be so harmful for my patients and for people all over this district. And days later, he voted for it anyway. And we deserve better. You deserve better. You deserve a representative who will stand up for you and fight for you and be a check and a balance against policies that only work for the special interests and the wealthiest Americans. Unfortunately, working for special interests and the wealthiest is exactly what my opponent has been doing as a career politician. He was a Trump delegate, and he will always put the president and his policies above yours. He supports a tax bill that gives 83% of the benefit to the wealthiest and wants to pay for it by cutting your Social Security and Medicare. He supports repealing the Affordable Care Act and taking protections away for people with pre-existing conditions. And he is the same Dino Rossi who has always opposed a woman's right to choose. He is wrong on the issues, and he is wrong for this district. Protecting my patients comes naturally to me. It's what I've done in my practice, and it's what I'll do as a member of Congress. I would be honored to earn your vote. Thank you.
Mr. Rossi, you have 90 seconds.
My grandparents settled in Black Diamond, Washington around the turn of the last century, where my grandfather was a coal miner. If you actually go in the basement of the Black Diamond Museum, my grandfather's two-man saw is up on the wall. I'm the youngest of 7, raised on a school teacher's salary. I grew up drinking powdered milk and eating hamburger helper without the hamburger. You know, folks couldn't afford to pay for college, but I wanted to go to school. So I worked a number of different jobs to make my way through the School of Business at Seattle University. I worked construction. I worked as a janitor waxing floors at the Space Needle. I started in the commercial real estate business with nothing but a janitorial job at night, scrubbing toilets and selling apartment buildings during the day. A year and a half later, when I was 25 years old, I bought my first apartment building and kept going from there. I was elected to the state Senate in my mid-30s, and I think I probably dropped the average age to 70 in the Senate when I was elected. By year 3, I was deputy leader of the Senate, and I went on to become the chairman of the Senate Ways and Means Committee. Silvino and Conchetta Rossi came to America, probably for the similar reasons why your families came to America. They came to America because they believed in America you can rise to any level that your talent and work ethic will take you. There's no guarantee of success in America, but you should have a shot at it. That's why I'm running for Congress. That's what needs to be preserved. And in the end, I think Silvino and Conchetta were right, because the grandson of that Black Diamond coal miner has a chance to represent in the United States Congress the very same area where he worked in those coal mines, only in America.
Thank you.
We're going to first start by talking about health care. Americans pay more for health care than any other nation, yet in many key indicators, including lifespans, we lag behind. Dino Rossi, what would you do to reduce costs and improve health care for all Americans? 1 minute, please.
So health care is an incredibly important issue in this race. And what we need to do is we make sure we bring competition into the system. And you can do it in various ways, by being able to buy across state lines and freeing up the mandates that we currently have. My opponent wants a government takeover of health care. And a government takeover of health care means that the government's going to pick your doctors, going to pick your hospital. We can't afford that. Even the left-leaning think tanks say that it's going to have to double our income taxes to pay for it. So the bottom line in the end is that if we actually free this up, and the system will work. It'll work if we have competition in the system. And right now we just don't have that. And I believe that as we move through this debate, you're going to hear more and more about these things, because the government takeover health care will destroy Medicare as we know it. And seniors are counting on Medicare. People that are paid into it for years are counting on it. And I want to make sure it's there for the future.
Kim Schrier, what would you do to reduce the cost of health care and make it better?
Of course. Well, I'm a pediatrician, and I am also a person who's been living with type 1 diabetes since the age of 16. So I understand our healthcare system as a doctor, but also as a patient. And I got into this race because I want to make sure that every family in this district, in this country, can afford the care that they need. And that means shoring up the Affordable Care Act, not sabotaging it like our president, and certainly not repealing it without a better replacement like my opponent would do. He supports dismantling the Affordable Care Act and taking away protections for people with pre-existing conditions. This would take health care away from 32,000 people in our district. He also doesn't believe that women can make their own health care decisions, and I think that is a critically important issue. One thing to understand is that I will always be a voice for the people in this district and making sure that people can afford the health care they need, and he will be a voice for insurance companies and big pharma. Thank you.
President Trump says we will always protect Americans with pre-existing conditions. We're going to take care of them. But the Trump Justice Department told a federal court it will no longer defend provisions of the Affordable Care Act that protect patients from being kicked off insurance because they have pre-existing conditions. So my question is, do you support what President Trump says or what his Justice Department does? Kim Schrier?
Well, I think we should always look at the actions more than we look at the words. And I don't trust that this president will follow through and protect people with pre-existing conditions, because he has run and his party has run for years now on repealing the Affordable Care Act, which would take away those very protections for people like me with type 1 diabetes.
Dino Rossi, what about pre-existing conditions? The president says we should keep them, and yet his Justice Department is doing nothing to defend them.
I've been very clear all along that we have to do something about pre-existing conditions, even if it's a subsidized high-risk pool, because it could bankrupt a family. I have pre-existing conditions in my family. That's a real concern. But when Obamacare came in, the Affordable Care Act, I lost my health care for myself, my wife, and my 4 children. I ended up with a lousy plan that cost 2.5 times as much, didn't cover things I want covered, covered things I didn't want covered, and I had a $12,000 family deductible on top of it. My goal is to have as many health insurance companies chasing you around for your business as I can possibly get. So you can decide what's in your plan versus some bureaucrat or politician in D.C. deciding for you. That's freedom. That's what we need to have. We need to have competition in that system to get that done.
Dino Rossi, do you believe women should continue to have the right to a legal abortion?
You know, I've always been very clear on this, too. I've never run on that issue. My opponents always have run on that issue. And my wife and I are both Catholic, believes every soul has a value. I really never believed that abortion was really intended for anything other than cases of rape, incest, or life of the mother. When I wrote budgets in Olympia as chairman of the Senate Ways and Means Committee, I laid down a railroad tracks to protect the most vulnerable, because every one of those lives are valuable. I protected the mentally ill. I protected the developmentally disabled and people in nursing homes, because I really believe that's important. I just most recently finished as chairman of the board of Special Olympics for the state of Washington. The USA Games that you saw here this last summer, I'm the chairman to help bring those here. So the most vulnerable are very important to me, and that's where it comes from, my belief in the importance of life.
Kim Schrier, where do you stand on women's right to abortion?
Well, first, I would say that you can say that you're not running on these issues, but this is a really important issue for the women in this district. You will have a congressional vote if you are in Washington, D.C., and I think we need, right now at a time when Roe v. Wade is threatened, when the Supreme Court is going hard right, we need advocates for women's health care. I will always support a woman's right to make her own health care decisions. I will support access to Plan B, which my opponent opposes. And I will always respect women's rights to make their own health care decisions. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Kim Schrier, you are committed to Medicare for all, but you work for a Virginia Mason clinic that does not accept all Medicaid plans. Isn't that inconsistent?
Well, let me be clear about my plan for health care, because there is definitely misunderstanding from my opponent, which is that I believe that we should have Medicare as a public option so that anybody at any age, and even small business owners, could buy into Medicare just like they could buy into private insurance. That would bring down prices across the board, and my plan then goes on to take on costs overall, but specifically the costs of our prescription drugs. And that's why I think it's really important to have a doctor, especially a woman doctor, taking this issue of our nation's healthcare crisis to Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Kim Schrier and Dino Rossi.
Turning now to trade, an issue that's critical for this state and this district. Tariffs and trade tensions have cost Washington farmers an estimated tens of millions of dollars in losses this year. Do you believe the current administration's trade tactics and tariffs are working? If not, how would you communicate that to the Trump administration? And what tools could you use in Congress to help farmers here? Dr. Schrier, you have 1 minute.
Well, the state of Washington is the most trade-dependent state in the nation, and the 8th District is particularly dependent on trade, especially in the agricultural areas, like right here in Kittitas County. I believe in fair trade agreements, and this means agreements where we protect workers, we protect jobs, and we protect the economy here in the 8th District. We also have environmental protections, and these agreements need to have the teeth to really enforce those standards. What's happening right now with this tariff war is really hurting our farmers. I spoke out long ago against these tariffs that are hurting our cherry farmers and our apple farmers and our hay farmers, while my opponent stayed silent. Look, if China decides that it is just too difficult and too expensive to do business with the state of Washington, it will take its business elsewhere, and our cherry farmers and apple farmers may never bounce back. This is why we need trade agreements and not trade wars.
Mr. Rossi, do you agree with the tariffs?
I've been very clear that I don't think anyone wins a trade war, and I've said that up front. And, you know, but here's what's going on. We now have an agreement with Canada and Mexico, and I've been endorsed by the Farm Bureau in every county and the State Farm Bureau as well. And 28% of our farm exports go to Canada and Mexico, and that's good. We also have a frame network now for the European Union and Japan as well. But I was on a trade mission representing Washington State with our Secretary of State in China, and we were in Beijing. And in Beijing, the leaders of the region were just reassuring us that, oh, we're cracking down on intellectual property theft. We're doing that. I walked out of the meeting, went around the corner. I was offered all of Microsoft products for $11 US. We went back to the Beijing hotel, and Jim Knapp, who's from Wenatchee, who was a port commissioner on the trade mission, he was madder than a hornet, because in the gift shop, he pulled up this apple. And he said it was a counterfeit apple. They actually just put a sticker that said Washington on it. We have everything from apples to airplanes in this district, and we have to be concerned about all of it. We're in a position now to actually have strength against China and actually get some proper rules that will protect our business.
So if you were advising the Trump administration, what would you say in how to negotiate with China?
Well, right now, the last quarter, manufacturing has dropped in China. We right now have an unemployment rate that is the lowest we've had since 1969. We're in a position of strength. You know, a company that goes over to China, American company, has to have 51% Chinese ownership. And that means it could be Chinese government ownership as well. They're taking our intellectual properties. And also, obviously, that's my story about the ag community. You know, we were also in Xi'an, and they were building parts for the Boeing planes, and they spent an hour and a half trying to convince us to let them build the whole plane. Well, that would be the worst thing you can do, because you know what they'll do at that point. Take all our technology and go build a plane on their own.
Dr. Schrier, what would be your advice to the Trump administration in negotiating with China?
Of course. My advice is that you don't have to throw uncertainty in and put our farmers at risk in order to secure and renegotiate a better trade agreement. And so I would say, come to the table. Let's look at the standards that we need that will protect American jobs, protect American workers, and protect our environment, and sit down and negotiate that without putting our farmers or Boeing at risk. Right now, every product that we export from the state of Washington is hit with a 5 to 25% tariff. That is hurting our country, it is hurting our state and our district.
Should the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, be rejoined?
The TPP has already passed. I do believe that we should be in trade agreements, and I've given you my standards for environmental protections, worker protections, labor protections. And so if it meets those standards and has teeth, then I would support an agreement like that, because we are always better having the United States in these agreements. Otherwise, they sink to the lowest common denominator. So I want the United States in these agreements to make sure that we have those standards, particularly environmental standards and worker standards.
Mr. Rossi, you referenced the new deal with Mexico and Canada. Congress must still approve the deal. Would you sign it as is? What do you like or dislike about it?
Well, the agricultural community likes it. Having an agreement between Canada and Mexico is incredibly important, like I said, because 28% of our exports from agricultural products go to those two countries. And it also sets up the framework where you can actually have negotiations and agreements with Japan and the European Union. Intellectual property, it had to be updated, and it's updated in this agreement as well. From what I've seen so far, it looks like it's heading in the right direction.
Final word to you, Dr. Schrier. Do you like the deal as is? Would you sign it?
I have not read the entire deal. I do like that we are trading and making agreements with our northern and southern partners. I don't believe that we had to throw away NAFTA or that we had to get into trade wars in order to negotiate a better deal.
All right. Thank you, candidates.
What's the biggest challenge to our economy? Dino Rossi, 1 minute, please.
I'd say the biggest challenge to our economy is people not understanding what makes the economy work. What you need for businesses to grow and for people to have jobs is you need modest taxation and fair and predictable regulation. Let entrepreneurs go be entrepreneurs. My opponent wants to raise people's taxes by $2,821 of every family in the 8th Congressional District. Actually pulling money out of people's back pockets isn't going to make it better. My opponent wants to double income taxes by actually having a government take over health care. My opponent supports a 57-cent a gallon gas tax that won't go to roads or congestion relief. My opponent also supports a state income tax. All these things, they don't create jobs. What you want to have is these small businesses growing. When they grow, they have to hire people. When they hire people, people have a chance to get a better job, and they get moved forward. And when there's a competition for employment, people's salaries go up, people's benefits go up. That's what you want. That's what you have to do. And right now, there are 7 million jobs in America that are unclaimed. We have an incredibly strong economy. We got to keep it going. But repealing the tax cuts, like my opponent would like to do, will kill 20,000 jobs in the state of Washington. And Puget Sound Energy lowered our gas and electric bill by over $100 million.
Let's hear from your opponent on this question. The question is, what's the biggest challenge to our economy, and what would you do to address the challenge? 1 minute, please, Kim Schrier.
Well, right now, middle-class families are getting squeezed, and that's why we really need to build our economy from the middle out and really invest in our economy right here in the 8th District. This means we need to make investments in education, in agriculture and technology, and in infrastructure so that we can bring jobs and grow jobs right here in the 8th District. I also believe that we should have middle-class tax cuts, because when you put money in the pockets of people in the middle class, they spend it, and again, will grow our economy from the middle out. This is in stark contrast with my opponent, who has really never, ever stood up for the best interests of working families. He ran for governor promising to cut the minimum wage. After the financial crisis, he voted against processes that would help small businesses get back up on their feet and against unemployment insurance. And not just that, he supports this tax plan that, again, gives 83% of the benefit to the wealthiest and to corporations and does not give nearly enough to the middle class. I will stick up for the middle class and working families every day. I don't trust that he will.
Dino Rossi, a KUOW listener asks about the tax bill. This listener writes, it'll add $1.5 trillion to the deficit. What will you cut from the budget to reduce this deficit, or would you support restructuring this tax cut?
First off, we need to make sure that the tax cuts for individuals are permanent. 80% of the money will go to people outside of the 1%. So let's get that straight first. But secondly, what would you do? I was chairman of the Senate Ways and Means Committee during the largest dollar deficit in state history. I had a 1-vote Republican majority, 6-vote Democrat majority in the House, Democrat governor at the time. I'm the one that balanced the biggest deficit in state history without raising taxes and still protected the vulnerable. Received the first annual Defender of Liberty Award from the Freedom Foundation for being the architect of the most fiscally conservative budget ever written in this state. So when you ask that question, I've actually done this before. I've done this before, and how did I do it? It's not one thing, it's not 5 things, it's not 100 things. It's thousands of decisions you have to make line by line through the budget, and that's what I've done. And there are a number of things that you can do to make this work, but you have to go through the budget just like I did in Olympia. And then I did everything in a bipartisan fashion. I actually got, obviously all the Republicans together. I had 5 moderate Democrats join me. It went through the Democrat-controlled House. Everything that I get attacked for in this campaign was bipartisan. Even the Speaker Chop voted for it. Gary Locke signed it all into law. And so that's what's really missing in D.C. You don't have anybody that seems to want to be able to work across party lines, and that's what I've done. So it's not theory or talk. I did it with your TV cameras in my face.
Kim Schrier, the same question to you. The tax bill will supposedly add $1.5 trillion to the deficit. How would you deal with that as a Congress member?
Well, I would back up a step and just say that's not a tax plan that I would have supported. It exploded our debt, and now all of a sudden fiscal responsibility has returned to Congress, and they want to pay for it by cutting our Social Security and Medicare and SNAP and other public benefits. Look, if everybody pays their fair share, then we don't have to talk about making draconian cuts to services that help the vast majority of people in this country. And frankly, Medicare and Social Security are earned benefits that we paid for and that need to be there for us when we retire.
One threat to employment in America is automation and artificial intelligence, which some predict will replace hundreds, thousands of jobs in the coming years. What do you think is the appropriate government strategy in order to prevent massive unemployment because of that?
Well, we're not there yet, and I do see that as a possibly upcoming threat. When we get there, I think we can talk about things like a universal basic income, but we're not there yet, and we still need people to run those machines and to do the programming for that machinery. So my eye is on that, but fortunately, we have not come to that place quite yet. Thank you.
Universal basic income, it's an idea that's been floated to try to deal with some of the dislocations in the economy. Dino Rossi, do you support it?
No, I do not support that. Let me tell you why. Well, we need to keep the economy strong because what ends up happening is there's opportunities and jobs for everybody. And there will be. My opponent just talked about everybody paying their fair share, but she wants to repeal the tax cuts that will give, a $2,821 increase to people, families, just regular families in the 8th Congressional District. That isn't going to solve these problems. It's just going to hurt families. And so, this is something that we're definitely going to disagree on.
I'd like to get back to a point that you made, Dino Rossi. You said we should make the personal tax cuts permanent. They're not under this tax plan. And I want to find out what you, Kim Schrier, if you agreed with that.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we need to do whatever we can to support the middle class. And I would add that $125 a month, that's okay for the middle class, but we could do so much better. It's really not enough, especially when you're cutting Medicare and Social Security to pay for it. It comes out as a net negative for middle class families.
Thank you, Kim Schrier.
That's a change of position, though, because my opponent on March 3rd at her Resistance Indivisible meeting said she wanted to repeal the tax cuts, period. And so now, apparently, the position is moving along and changing as we speak.
Would you like to respond, Kim Schrier?
Of course. This has been fact-checked up and down. My position has always been clear that I oppose the part of that tax plan that gave the vast majority of the benefits to the wealthiest and to corporations, and we know that does not trickle down, and it did not do nearly enough for the middle class. So if I were reworking it, I would take away some of those benefits for the wealthiest, close the loopholes that let people get away without paying their fair share, and keep benefits for the middle class.
Thank you, Kim Schrier and Dino Rossi.
Before we get to our next question, we are inviting the audience here in the hall and also those of you watching live to select a topic that you want to see addressed later in this debate. Here are the choices: Social Security and Medicare, gun policy, or veterans and the military. To vote, go to WA-debates.org. That's WA-debates.org. Now turning to immigration, another big issue. There are reports that the Trump administration may be considering a new family separation policy. According to administration officials speaking to the Washington Post, one option is for the government to detain families together for up to 20 days, then give parents a choice of staying in detention with their child or allow the child to be taken to a shelter, ultimately separated from their parents. So to both of you, should this policy in any form be resumed? And what would you do to address illegal crossings at the border? There are reports of a new caravan from Central America seeking asylum to the U.S. Dr. Schrier, 1 minute, please.
Well, we are a nation of immigrants, and immigration is one of the most important topics here in the 8th District. What we're seeing at our southern border is just evidence of the inhumane policies of this administration that really are only allowed to take place because of a broken immigration system, and that time and again, Democrats and Republican career politicians have failed to come to the table to really pursue common sense, comprehensive immigration reform that will secure our borders and keep families together and have an earned path to citizenship for people who are already here and working and keeping our economy afloat. And so I support comprehensive immigration reform. Now, my opponent, he ran his campaign wanting a tall fence with a high gate, which sounds a lot like this president's $25 billion border wall, which is something I do not support and I think would be a huge waste of our tax dollars. So he will be part of the problem. I will be part of the solution. I want comprehensive immigration reform.
Mr. Rossi.
It's too easy to get here illegally and too hard to get here legally. That's the problem. And we have to make sure that we have border security, whether it's a physical barrier or could be electronic monitoring or human beings as well. But we have to make sure that we have a functioning border. Without a functioning border, you really don't have a country. And so we have to make sure that happens. You know, as far as separating families, I said right up front that we shouldn't be separating families. That's not something we should be doing. The other thing, too, when it comes to immigration, especially for the agricultural community and others, is that we need to have a guest worker program that works. And guest worker program is separate from immigration. It's different. People are going to come from another country, do the work, and then go back to where they came from. But we need to know who's coming. We need to know who's coming and going in our country. That is really the question here. Are we going to have a dysfunctional border or a functional border? I think we should have a functional border. And I think at that point, we can actually move through some of these points that need to be addressed.
Before moving on to worker visas, I want to press you on both because I didn't quite hear clear responses to how you would deal with thousands of migrants coming, seeking asylum from Central America. Mr. Rossi.
There is a process for seeking asylum. You go to a border crossing. It's not you just walk across the border and then claim asylum. You actually go to a border crossing. So there already is a process in place if you need to seek asylum. That's what they should do.
Dr. Schrier.
Of course, and I think we should distinguish between typical paths of immigration and a refugee crisis, and that there is a different pathway. And so coming and demonstrating that there is real threat and getting a court date is the way that we should handle these cases, that there's no need to imprison families, there's no need to separate children from their parents, that you should come and get an ankle bracelet or a wristband and a court date and go through due process as we've always done. We should prioritize deporting criminals, not harassing families.
I'm sure you've heard many times from farmers in the district that they struggle with a labor shortage, and the temporary worker visa program continues to be a problem for them. So how would you modernize the H-2A visa program, Dr. Schrier?
Right. The H-2A visa program does not work well for either the farmers or for the workers, and can lead to sort of a pattern of indentured servitude where a worker is essentially held hostage by a potentially abusive farmer or farm owner. And so that's why we have to have reform and make sure that our laborers are protected, that we have visas like an H-2A, but a reformed H-2A so that workers are protected and farmers are protected and can get the seasonal labor that they need. Our economy here in the 8th District depends on agriculture, and we need to make sure that the workers, the highly skilled orchard workers, are here and trained and available during the seasons that we need them.
Mr. Rossi.
I don't believe our farmers are abusive, number one. Number two, I've already talked about it, the guest worker program. This is something it's broken. We need to make sure that we know who is coming here and make sure that they can get here, do the work, and go back to their home country. And this is all part that has to happen. I think it's going to happen after this election, because right now it seems like a bunch of political posturing. But you're playing with people's lives when you do that. That's not right. You shouldn't be doing that.
Congress has still not been able to reach a legislative fix for the hundreds of thousands of young undocumented immigrants known as Dreamers. So briefly, in about 30 seconds, Mr. Rossi, would you support a standalone DACA bill if Democrats take back the House?
I've been very clear as well that we're talking about 690,000 people who would be taken and shipped back to a country that they don't even know. That's not even logical. We shouldn't do that. But we need to make sure we have border security first, or we're going to end up in the same boat again 2 or 3 years from now. It's exactly the same problem we're going to have. But I don't think we're going to get there until after this election's over, because everybody just once again seems to be posturing and not wanting to solve the problem. And so those both things have to happen. We took a bill before, Ronald Reagan did in 1986. He was promised border security. Never happened. We can't allow that to happen again.
Dr. Schrier, if Republicans hold the House, what kind of border security measures would you support if they're part of a larger DACA bill?
Of course. Well, first of all, I wholeheartedly support the Dreamers 2017 DREAM Act. I believe we should have a clean DACA bill, not tied to anything else, and certainly not held hostage in budget negotiations. 87% of the population in this country understands that Dreamers, these DACA young adults and kids, deserve permanent legal status. And it is astonishing to me, and abhorrent really, that their fates were held up in budget negotiations. We can have border security without a wall, including drones and technology and intelligence. We do not need a border wall to secure our borders.
Thank you, candidates.
Let's turn to the environment. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change just released a report that said if we want to avoid dire consequences from climate change, one of the things we must do is phase out coal. President Trump says he wants the U.S. to burn more coal. Dino Rossi, who's right? 1 minute, please.
Well, I take a back seat to nobody when it comes to the environment. I've been, the things I've actually done. I spent 6 years on the board of the Nature Conservancy and on the board of the Mountain Sound Greenway as well. I helped assemble the Greenway, received the Good Greens Deed Award twice from the Washington Conservation voters. I ended up rebuilding the Issaquah hatchery when they were trying to shut it down. These things are of concern to me. We need to make sure that our environment is secure for the future. That's really the things that I've actually fought for in time and time again. So it's not theory or talk. I've done it. We have to make sure our air is clean, our water's clean. We have to make sure that you talked about climate change, that we save our dams. Our dams are 80% of our power. It's carbon free. My opponent told Senator Warnick, who represents this district in the state Senate, about 6 months ago, that to save the salmon, we need to tear down the dams. I don't agree with that. I think that would be a travesty. What would it do to Eastern Washington? What would it do to our power rates?
For an answer to this question also, please. Kim Schrier, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change correct when it says we need to phase out coal, or is the president correct when he says we need to burn more coal?
This is a critical issue, and I should mention that award from the Washington Conservation voters is so old it could have its own driver's license. They have endorsed me in this race because they know I take this issue seriously, and I will absolutely be a champion for climate action, and they know that he has a 0 rating from Washington Conservation voters. So yes, I look at this as a pediatrician and a mom, and what our actions today really mean for the next generation and generations beyond. I'm a person with a background in science, and I'm frustrated that this has become a political issue. And frankly, the 8th District is a place where we have an opportunity to be a leader for the country and for the world on how you can grow an economy and do the right thing for the environment. And that starts with not subsidizing the fossil fuel industry or supporting coal. And it means investing instead in clean energy technologies like wind and sun, and in infrastructure and jobs just like the ones students here at Central are studying for in their integrated energy management program. I will absolutely be a champion for environmental protection.
Rossi, I didn't really hear the answer to my last question, which was, should the U.S. phase out coal or burn more coal?
I haven't been a supporter of coal. We don't have coal burning plants in the state of Washington. But let's get back to what we do have to protect the environment. Our dams, 80% of these dams are or any percent of our power comes from these dams. You know, my opponent is actually endorsed by organizations that want to tear down the dams. They say to save the fish, but we spent hundreds of millions of dollars retrofitting these dams. 97% of the salmon get through. And these very same organizations don't want to call it a renewable energy. A renewable energy. As long as it keeps raining around here, I'm pretty sure it's a renewable energy. And that's exactly what needs to happen. We have to make sure that we preserve these for the future.
Dino Rossi, do you support President Trump's withdrawal from the Climate Accord of Paris? Yes or no, and why?
Well, if it were an actual real treaty, President Obama would have brought it through the Senate to take care of it, but he didn't. What it did was it allowed China and India, the two of the biggest polluters, off the hook. And that's what it did. It handcuffed America and then let them get off the hook. And so I think we can move forward in a different way without that.
Dr. Schrier, what do you think about President Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord?
I think it's absolutely the wrong move. This is a place where we should be joining with our fellow citizens around the world. This is a global issue. It's something that we should be joining with all other nations. We are the only country that has pulled out of that, and we are the second largest producer of CO2 emissions in the world. It is our responsibility to clean up our mess. It is our responsibility and obligation to the rest of the world to join and partner in what should be a common interest that we all have in making sure that we protect this planet for the generation and this generation and generations long after we're gone.
Well, your district, District 8, if you're elected, you need to take a hit economically if we move forward on some of these environmental issues we'd like to see.
No, I don't think our district would take a hit at all. In fact, I think, look at all the jobs in solar and wind that there are. Look at our incredible capacity for an infrastructure bill and a new modernized electrical grid. These are jobs that we could bring right here to the 8th District, grow our economy and diversify our economy and do the right thing for the environment. I would be proud to be a leader there.
Kim Schrier and Dino Rossi, thank you.
Now to your governing style. Both of you, Dr. Schrier and Mr. Rossi, have recently gone negative against your opponent in political attack ads. Before, the negative ads were coming mainly from outside groups, but starting this month, it's your individual campaign. So why go negative? And do you think that that helps solve partisan divisions in this country? Dr. Schrier, you have the first minute.
Well, I think we're all frustrated by the negative ads and the attacks. And frankly, the root of this is all of the money that's in our politics. I mean, really, what we are seeing is the Citizens United decision that allowed unlimited quantities of dark money to come into our elections and to buy our elections and our politics. And this is what really needs to stop. There's only one person up here who really wants campaign finance reform, and that's me, because ultimately those attacks that are leveled at me, which have all been debunked, are coming from CLF, the Congressional Leadership Fund, which is Paul Ryan's super PAC. And that is heavily funded by the fossil fuel industry, by big pharma, by insurance companies, and of course they will say or do anything about my record in order to keep this seat for the Republicans. They know that I will take them on. I will take on big pharma and insurance to make sure people get the care they need, and that is why we need money out of politics.
Mr. Rossi, why go negative?
Well, actually, what we've done is, in my campaign, is we're going to compare and contrast what my opponent wants to do with what we want to do. And but it's been interesting. My opponent's #1 supporter is Nancy Pelosi, who's probably spent more money against me than any other human being in America at this point in time. And over $4 million with these negative ads, false ads. They're false ads. They're things that have been debunked over the years. The same ones keep coming back again and again. You know, you want to talk about governing style. I have an opponent who comes from the resistance movement. You come from the resistance movement, you're telling the world that you're really not willing to work with anybody else unless they agree with you. My opponents marched in more protests, angry protests in Seattle than parades in the district. You know, I had my kickoff breakfast, campaign kickoff with Steve Largent, Seahawk, Steve Largent. I had 8 protesters out front, and my opponent was one of the 8 protesters, put it up on Facebook, standing there with a nasty sign about me. Now, I worked across party lines. You cannot work across party lines by doing that. We have enough people yelling at each other in politics without adding another one. I was actually very, very successful in business and in politics and in life by not yelling at people. There's no way you can work across party lines by yelling at somebody.
Dr. Schrier, I want to give you a chance to respond. Mr. Rossi has said you're part of the resistance movement.
Of course. Well, I'm a pediatrician and a mom, and I got into this race because Congress was not doing its job, was not providing checks and balances, and was attempting to take health care away from my patients and people all over this district. And I thought it was really important to stand up and go to bat for people all over this district. I don't think there's anything radical about wanting people in this country to have health care and to be taken care of and to want to have a government that really works on behalf of the people and not just on behalf of special interests. And that's the difference between a community pediatrician and a career politician. I will work for the people in this district, not for special interests.
You know, back on the actual ads, my opponent's running an ad directly from her campaign about business dealings. And the Seattle Times went after that ad. And they went to talk about Mike Mastro, and they actually interviewed the trustee who was defending and going after Mastro on behalf of the victims. And what he said is that the ad is, what it is it's a character assassination based upon guilt by association, and he called it a low-life smear, a low-life smear. That's not the kind of campaigns we want to see happen. We're going to talk about the issues. That's what we're going to do. Would
you like to defend that ad?
I stand by my ad. I'm Kim Schrier. I approve that message.
Okay. Okay. Turning back to the current House of Representatives, Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff of California wrote a recent op-ed in which he said the Republican-controlled Congress has failed to assert itself and review or investigate the conduct of the executive and has also been, quote, complicit in some of the president's most egregious attacks on our democratic institutions. So, Mr. Rossi, do you think there needs to be more oversight, and how would you stand up to the president when needed?
Well, I've been very clear on that one throughout this campaign as well, is that I'm actually running to be the congressman from the 8th Congressional District. You know, the Constitution says there are 3 separate co-equal branches of government. I'm going to treat the president the way I would have treated any president. If I agree with him, I agree with him. I don't. I'm not running to be the apprentice. You know, part of what's going on, and the same thing happens in Olympia as well, is that they put forward legislation, they give it to the executive branch to go ahead and write rules. And it's a way for politicians to just kind of wash their hands of it without having responsibility. I would like to see the big pieces that the agencies write come back to the legislative branch, so you can go thumbs up or thumbs down. And then the public can decide if they want to throw you out of office or not. You know, that's what's missing. That's a piece that's missing. But the reason is because politicians don't want to be responsible.
And Dr. Schrier, some Democratic members in the House are already talking about investigations into the president, his policies, even Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, if Democrats win back the House. Is that what you would like to see if elected to Congress? What would you like to see investigated?
Well, look, we have evidence that a foreign country, Russia, interfered in our elections and in our public discourse. And this should not be a partisan issue. This should not be something that only Democrats are concerned about, because this affects our national security. I think we ought to all be concerned when we have a foreign country meddling in our elections. I think that protecting the Mueller investigation ought to be a bipartisan priority, but I am the only one up here who will absolutely commit to protecting the Mueller investigation. My opponent won't. I want to get to the bottom of the truth. Truth should not be a partisan issue. I want to see where the facts lead and what the evidence is, and then go from there. But we all deserve to know. We have an election coming up in less than 3 weeks. I would like to know what happened in our 2016 elections.
We're going to turn to foreign policy next. And just this afternoon, U.S. intelligence services are saying it's very likely that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is complicit in the brutal murder and torture of a Washington Post writer at the Saudi embassy in Istanbul. What is the correct U.S. response to what we know about this right now? 1 minute from you, Mr. Rossi.
We have to find out exactly what happened. And I know Secretary of State Pompeo has been over in investigating this, and I think we need to know what's going on. You know, whether it's an ally or not, we really can't allow that sort of thing to happen if it were true. And so we have to be diligent with this. We also have to be cognizant of the fact that the one thing Iran would love to have is us to have a wedge between us and Saudi Arabia, because they're the ones that have been helping us, and because Iran are actually is enemy of Saudi Arabia. So we have to make sure that we work through this, and if it is true, then people need to be brought to justice by their country, and move forward from there.
Kim Schrier, 1 minute from you about what you think is the appropriate U.S. response to these intelligence service reports that the Saudi government complicit with this murder and torture.
Of course. I find it deeply concerning and highly alarming that this would happen, and I find it very curious that on the same day that the screws are tightening on Mohammed bin Salman, that $100 million just got channeled to the United States. This is not just a U.S. response. This needs to be a response from everybody around the world, that different countries and organizations all need to speak out when we see other countries attempt to silence, kill, jail, otherwise suppress the free press. This is a journalist, and we ought to all be alarmed when the press is being called enemy number one and reporters are being silenced. So there needs to be accountability. Again, I will wait and see what the evidence shows, but the evidence is looking pretty damning right now.
I'd like to get back to something that you mentioned a little bit earlier, Kim Schrier. U.S. intelligence agencies say Russia is trying to influence our elections. There are credible political scientists who say that Russia did tip the 2016 presidential election. Are the current efforts underway to prevent Russian interference in the upcoming election that you're running in adequate?
Well, I wish we knew what all was being done to protect these elections. I don't think we know, and I have no faith that this administration has really pursued the truth in order to safeguard our elections. I don't think this has been taken seriously enough. This should have started right after the 2016 election. We are only now hearing about some of the steps being taken. I believe that in Washington State, we are safe because we have a really nice way of voting by paper and voting by mail. But I cannot say that for voting machines throughout this country that could be hacked.
Dino Rossi, what do you think about the Russian attempts to disrupt our elections, and particularly the upcoming election? Are we doing enough to stop that?
We shouldn't let anybody disrupt our elections in any way, shape, or form. What they're trying to do is create chaos. You know, I was an election observer in the Macedonian parliamentary elections, and I witnessed a system that actually was very secure and very safe. Why was that? Well, when all the ballots were cast, the 26 different political parties were in the room together while they counted every ballot one by one, precinct by precinct. Having people that didn't trust each other together, watching what was going on, made it a very secure system. Now, having influence from the outside into our system is something that we can't tolerate. But you know what? They've been doing it for years, and they're going to continue to do it. It's not just Russia, it's other countries as well. We can't allow anybody to mess with our system.
I want to ask about North Korea also. Should the U.S. tolerate a North Korea with nuclear weapons capable of striking the U.S., including Washington State? And if the United States should not tolerate this, what is to be done? Kim Schrier?
Well, I'm worried at all times about nuclear arms in the hands of unstable leaders. And so I am deeply concerned about the nuclear capabilities in North Korea, and think that working towards nuclear disarmament is absolutely the direction we should be headed. We need to do this through diplomacy and a State Department. I am heartened by recent negotiations between North and South Korea, that they seem to be working in the right direction. But I really believe this is why we need to fully fund our State Department and make sure we have negotiators to really lead to a denuclearized Korean Peninsula.
Dino Rossi, do you think we're doing enough in that regard when it comes to North Korea?
Denuclearization is the only option. Then progress has been made. When we have the remains of our people from our soldiers from the Korean War conflict have actually been brought back to America, so their families can bury them honorably. That's progress. You know, the fact that not shooting missiles off right now, that's progress. Really, we have to make sure that we do denuclearize that peninsula. And the only way to do that is to make sure we keep sanctions up. You have to keep the sanctions up to make it very difficult for them to actually operate. And so, you know, these are things that have to happen. You know what? I'd rather be talking to them than shooting at them. That really is what I'd like to see happen.
Kim Schrier, could you expand a little bit about nuclear disarmament, not just North Korea, Iran, and other countries that might pose a threat? What would you actually do when it comes to that?
Of course, this is why we need a well-funded State Department so that we can have these negotiations. Look, we have far too many nuclear weapons in this world, and when they fall into the hands of bad actors, we are all in danger. I believe that nuclear weapons should be a deterrent, and that we should minimize the number of nuclear weapons that exist in the world. And this means having agreements so that we can denuclearize here and abroad while still keeping this country safe.
Thank you, Kim Schrier and Dino Rossi.
So we're nearing the end of our time. The final topic has been selected by you, the audience. A reminder that the choices were Social Security and Medicare, gun policy, or veterans and the military, and you chose gun policy. So that brings us to this question. Washington voters will be deciding this November on whether or not to raise the age of purchase for semi-automatic rifles to 21. So how would you vote on this state initiative, I-1639? Should the rules for handguns and semi-automatic rifles be the same or different? Dr. Schrier, you have 1 minute.
Sure. You know, guns are the #3 cause of death in children. And I am a mom, and I'm a pediatrician. And that is what makes me so motivated to take on this really difficult issue and really important issue of keeping our kids safe. Look, I send my child to public school every day, and no parent should ever have to worry about their child's safety at school. And as a pediatrician, I understand that 3 out of 4 gun deaths in this district are from suicide, and I take care of depressed teenagers. And so what I want are to have guns owned safely. And that means making sure that they are locked up and not in the hands of children. It also means having universal background checks and reporting systems and making sure that guns never fall into the hands of people with a history of domestic violence or severe mental illness. Now, my opponent has an A rating from the NRA, and in his past election had $450,000 of advertising put on TV on his behalf. I can tell you that I will sit down with anyone to keep our children safe. He will not make those moves because he's supported by the gun lobby.
So to clarify, do you support raising the age of purchase?
I do.
Mr. Rossi, do you support it?
Well, I'm the father of 4, and just a few weeks ago, my wife and I became grandparents for the first time. And there's nothing more precious to me than my children and my grandchildren, just like everybody else that's watching right now. You know, and when you talk about safety and things, safety in schools and issues like that, there's nothing more precious to us, but there was more security getting in this building than there actually is going into a school. We have 296 school districts in this state. I'm not saying we should arm teachers, but I think we should have school resource officers to make sure we protect our children. You know, I've said all along that I'm willing to work with anybody that actually has a solution that's effective and constitutional. Because when I'm sworn in as a member of Congress, I'm sworn in to actually uphold the Constitution. It's not just the First Amendment, but it's also the Second Amendment as well. And I plan on doing that. You know, I don't believe, and that many people don't believe, that provision and a few other provisions in there are actually constitutional, but the courts will decide that.
So again, to clarify, you are not in support of raising the age from 18 to 20. Why should there be different rules for handguns and semi-automatic rifles?
If that's brought to the Supreme Court too, I think that could be changed as well. If someone actually brought it to the Supreme Court. Many people think so.
This has been a very contentious issue in Congress. Where do you think there is room for compromise between Republicans and Democrats on gun safety measures? Dr. Schrier.
It's so interesting because I've been traveling this district a lot and talking with a lot of people, gun owners and non-gun owners, Republicans and Democrats. And what I have found is that the vast majority of people who own guns also want guns owned safely and not in the hands of children. And so I don't believe these issues are controversial. I believe this is just part of safe gun ownership, and that the only reason that we have not been able to come to the middle and pass some really good common sense legislation is because the gun lobby is buying our politicians. And I believe we need to hold anybody who is running for office and taking money from the NRA, from the gun lobby, accountable. We need common sense solutions, and we will not be able to get there unless we get gun money out of our politics.
Do you agree, Mr. Rossi? Is the gun lobby too powerful?
Well, I haven't taken any money from the NRA, and the automatic weapons are actually illegal in this country. And there are sometimes devices like the bump stock that will turn these semi-automatic weapons into full automatic weapons. I don't support that, and I think that we bipartisan support to eliminate those sorts of things. We would probably be able to come together on some of those type of issues.
On the topic of keeping schools safe, what kind of measures do you think could get bipartisan support at the federal level for schools across the country? Dr. Schrier.
Sure. Well, there are a couple ways to do this. I mean, one is just making sure that we have good background checks, universal background checks and reporting systems, and really make sure that guns don't get into the hands of people with a history of domestic violence, because that is the #1 predictor. But the other is really making sure that we have students watching students, and that we have counselors in every school. Because we know that ultimately, when it is the student who is the perpetrator, it's usually not from mental illness. It is from being alienated or bullied or abused. And that if we have students watching out for students who might be in distress, and if we have counselors in the school, that we can reduce that risk as well. And I think both of those are places that we could come together in the middle, and I will sit down again with anybody to keep our children safer in school. I don't know that my opponent will, because he is bought and sold by the gun lobby.
Mr. Rossi, your response.
When you look at the tragedy that happened in Florida, this person had encountered the police many different occasions. It also had history of mental illness. It wasn't flagged. He shouldn't have had a weapon in the first place. There are certain people that shouldn't have weapons. We got to make sure that they don't get them. And what I talked about before, which is having school resource officers. 296 school districts in the state, but they don't all have the same capacity. We may have to help with that. That's very possible, because we have to protect our children. I think that is where we could probably find some agreement. I really do.
And do you agree with Dr. Schrier and more counselors?
Well, obviously, counselors that we have in the schools should be hopefully looking for these things already. And they're going to identify students that need help.
Dr. Schrier, finally, do you agree with Mr. Rossi on more school resource officers?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, we found some common ground there. That's all we have time for tonight's debate. Thank you so much to the candidates for coming here to Central Washington University to discuss the big issues in the race for the 8th District.
And we hope it'll help you make up your mind when you go into the voting booth. Tonight's debate, organized by the Washington State Debate Coalition and its founder, Seattle CityClub. The coalition, comprised of civic leaders, nonpartisan organizations, colleges and universities, and media partners, all dedicated to setting a high standard for political debates. Thanks to our lead sponsors, AARP of Washington, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the NORCLIFFE Foundation, along with supporting sponsors. They include the Boeing Company, Smith-Barbieri, Progressive Fund, and Washington Realtors.
And believe it or not, ballots will be in the mail in the next few days. And remember, they must be returned by 8 p.m. on Election Day. That is Tuesday, November 6th. Please make sure to vote. And for now, as we say goodbye from Central Washington University, it's finally time when the audience can show its appreciation for the candidates. Thank you both.